Hi, my name is Pat McKay, and I'm the manager at the Rochester Hills Museum at Van Hoosen Farm. What follows is an interview we did with Dr. Gladys McKenney. Dr. McKenney is a member of the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame, and locally she's a member of our Community Hall of Fame. And she made a donation of these dolls that she created to celebrate women's suffrage leaders and women that inspire other women even today. Dr. McKenney was a longtime resident here in the Rochester community, a teacher in the Rochester community schools, and her goal with this program is to inspire people who struggle with questions and comments and being held back and discrimination. It's a wonderful story of hope and motivation. And I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Gladys McKenney. All right, well, Gladys, welcome to the Rochester Hills Museum. We're going to start off our program this morning in our interview with you, just asking you to state your name.
Well, Gladys McKenney.
All right, and where were you?
Excuse me, yeah. Gladys McKenney.
Okay, and where were you born?
I was born in Jackson, Michigan.
Okay, and who were your parents?
Well, my dad was a high school math and chemistry teacher, Walter Holdeman, and my mother taught, before she was married, she taught in a one-room country school. She had to drive with a horse and buggy, build the fire in the furnace, and
well, is that where you got your passion for learning and teaching then?
Yes.
Okay, and what did your dad do?
What did he do? We taught math and chemistry in the local high school, and I grew up with the famous mantra that I used to spout was, I'm never going to be a teacher, and I'm never going to marry a teacher. And I grew up and I did both.
Wow, okay.
But I'm so glad I did.
So what year were you born?
1928.
Okay, so that makes today, in 2021, how old are you?
93.
93, all right. Tell us a little bit about yourself growing up in Jackson, Michigan.
Well, I was raised on a farm, and my mother and dad raised all the fruits and vegetables, and we had cows and pigs, and I was very active in the 4-H organization, and I won the pig showmanship championship one year for the county, and then Lyle Cunningham beat me out. And when I went for the state, so I came in second in the state, and cattle judging team too I was on. So I was a farm girl, and my goal was to go out west, and never going to marry because I wasn't going to have any man boss me. And that used to really amuse my father, and he used to throw it up to me after I got married and had my children, and was very happy with doing that.
So did you grow up in the city limits of Jackson, or in? No,
10 miles outside.
Okay.
There's a little town nearby called Sandstone, which had a filling station and a grocery store. But it had a little church and a one-room country school. And that's where I went for the first 8 grades. And they had potlucks at least once a month and a dance at the community building, and there was a very definite, strong sense of community in about 100 square mile area. But the dances were well supervised, and you just had a feeling you were taken care of, and there were limits and you could have fun with friends, and it was very. I thought we used to say we lived in the sticks, kind of deprecatingly, but it was a very precious heritage.
So you went all the way through high school in that?
Well, my high school, we had there was a local high school in the town of Parma, which was a farming community. My dad taught in Jackson High School, and he just was biased, of course. He thought we'd get a better education in the school where he taught. But and we could ride there with him, and so we went to Jackson High School.
So you didn't pursue a career in chemistry. How did you decide what you were going to do when you graduated from high school?
You know, looking back at my vocational choices, I was really very naive. I went in the School of Social Work, was what I was going to do, and I got a degree in psychology. I didn't have really the slightest idea of what I was going to do with it. And I was going to apply at Ace Spark Plugs, had an opening for testing. And there was a young man that was a senior, and he had never gone to a J-Hop, the senior class. They didn't call it J-Hop, but the dance. And so he felt in his senior year he really ought to ask somebody. And there was a night that I was involved in arranging some blind dates for friends. And I was wanting to make sure everybody knew everybody. So I made sure that they all were introduced, and this young man looked at this woman and thought, if I ever marry her, I'll have to have my head examined. And his name was Bob McKenney. And later on, when he needed the date for the J-Hop, by then we had realized that our classes were close, so we would walk together. So he got a little bit better acquainted with me and decided it was okay to ask me to the J-Hop. And that started a 63-year, well, 65-year, because it was a couple years.
So he was a high school sweetheart.
Yes.
That you met him in high school?
Yeah, he lived in Detroit. He didn't have any brothers or sisters. And he'd come to Michigan State, became a math teacher, and was here in the teaching principal in elementary schools for a couple of years, and then he taught math in high school in Rochester.
You met Bob in college then? You were in,
yes.
as part of your undergraduate in psychology.
At Michigan State.
At Michigan State?
Oh,
okay.
Yes.
And then when did that evolve into a teaching career?
Very gradually.
Okay.
We had, when we moved here, we had one child, Wayne, and then when I was expecting Michael, we had Wayne and then we had Kathy. And when I was expecting Michael, we got the diagnosis for Kathy that she had lymphocytic leukemia. And the Dr. Wolf Zelzer, who was a world-famous hematologist, it was in Children's Hospital, set us down in the room and told us, your daughter has a disease, it's a death sentence with no repeal. And so we lost Kathy then when she was 2 years old. And then we were very fortunate. Yeah, we had Marcia and Linda after that. So we had Wayne, Michael, Marcia, and Linda. And they all went through the Rochester school system. And a couple of them went to Michigan State, and others went to local schools here. And it was very good.
So you ended up at Michigan State for your undergraduate, and then is that where you got your teaching background? Was that at Michigan State also?
Yes. Well, I went to Wayne State to get a provisional certificate. I took a few more classes and enrolled in the master's degree, got a master's degree in guidance and counseling. And then I went back later and got the doctorate in education, curriculum development. And I was kind of the illegitimate child of the social studies department here when I was hired. I was hired in '54. And then, of course, with the riots in Detroit and...
So did you and Bob come together to the Rochester schools, the Rochester Community Schools?
Well, he was principal for in Goodison School for a couple of years. Started out at John R. And then Goodison 2 years, and then he came to the high school. So he was at one end of the high school and I was the other. My kids didn't have a chance. But Rochester was a good place to teach, and I'm not sure, part of it may have been because Bob had a good reputation and I was his wife, but I felt like I was, as I said, like I was the illegitimate child of the social studies department, because I think partly because my master's is in guidance and counseling, and partly because of what the classes that I was hired to teach. George Stringer had been a counselor in Rochester, and he felt a need for a class to be offered to the seniors called Social Living. And it dealt with problems of choosing a school after graduation, job preparation, budgeting, also questions about relationships. And in there, I became known as a sex lady with answering questions that I didn't feel prepared to answer. I had a suggestion box, so the students would drop questions in there. And looking back, that suggestion box was the birthplace for this program that I developed, because I heard so many stories in which either the mother was being abused or the daughter was being abused, and the girl's low self-image, their lack of feeling of future, those kind of issues. And one of my first days teaching, I'd only been there 3 months or so, and I had developed this suggestion box right away. The school nurse came to me, and she wanted to talk to me. And she said, the rich ones go to Europe and the poor ones use Coke bottles. I really didn't know what she was talking about for a minute. And then that's when the issue of abortion began to concern me more. And then we only had a couple students, well, in fact, one, I guess, at that point, that were black. But the riots in '67 and brought the racial issues home to me. And we were very fortunate in Rochester. At one point, we hired Agnes Fisher, was our woman that was in charge of special ed for the district. And Agnes was black, and she had trained with Martin Luther King to integrate the theaters in Alabama. And she just was a very open, wonderful woman. And I invited her to come in and speak to my classes. And after the first hour, word got around, and so other teachers wanted to bring their classes too. So we took them to the auditorium, and I remember sitting there with the high school, one of the administrators, and being concerned about the restlessness of the students. But that was fine, and everything. She did a wonderful presentation. Students asked great questions. The next day, one of the teachers was coming down the hall towards me with fire in his eyes. And he came up to me and he said, "What the hell are you trying to start out here?" And later on, I had a black minister from Detroit who came to talk about nonviolence, and again ended up with the whole auditorium filled. And they asked him about, what would you do if your wife was being attacked? And you know, he gave this standard answer, and and the students were getting angrier and angrier at this very gentle man. And again, the assistant principal said, "We'll be lucky if we get out of here without a riot." And but I was able to teach a class on black studies. And one day I did walk in my classroom and saw a noose hanging over the lamp fixture, which was unsettling, and I got a few phone calls, but outside of that.
Were you at Rochester High School at that time? Is that where you were teaching?
Pardon?
Were you at Rochester High School?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I taught in Beaverton for 2 years, but I didn't get any controversy up there. Beaverton was a farming community up near Gladwin, and I taught English up there and had them write very self-examination essays and so on. So I didn't stir up much. And well, I didn't become a rabble-rouser until I moved to Rochester.
So when did your interest and passion in talking about women and successful women leadership?
Well, it wasn't this one instance, but there was a girl came to me after school one time, and she pulled her hair back, and she had a big bruise on her face. And she said her mother did it, but she said, "I won't. If you tell anybody, I'll deny it." But then in talking about it, I began to see that the mother had been abused also, and I began hearing more and more situations where women would be left, there'd be a divorce, and the women didn't have any idea what they wanted to do, and they felt diminished, and there were just a number of things, and the girls having the girls in my class being less likely to have a sense of direction, except getting married and having a house. And then there were other personal things, like Bob and I wanted to get a stereo, you know, back with the needles and all that, and the show tunes that I loved to hear. And so I went down to a little stereo store that was right on Main Street up the hill in Rochester. And I went to buy the stereo, and they 90 days, Bob said, "Go on down and tell them what they do 90 days same as cash," because they had a big ad there. And when I went to buy, I picked out what I wanted, and they said, "Well, have your husband come in and sign." And I said, "Well, I've taught in Rochester for, by then it was 3 or 4 years, and well, I still had to have Bob to sign." And then I had put a deposit on a Chrysler at one of the local cars, and I went to pick the car up, and they'd sold it to somebody else. And I had one of my daughters with me, and she said, "Mom, is this how black people feel?" Because she felt that I was treated, they're talked down to and everything. And I thought, what kind of an example am I setting for? Because I very meekly, I mean, I didn't raise a fuss about it. I just very meekly accepted what was going on. But so there were a number of things like that.
So at some point you realized that women needed their own role models to look up to.
Yeah.
And is that where the doll idea came up with, though, as a way of starting to commemorate some of these fabulous foremothers?
It wasn't until after I retired that I came up with this idea. I took a couple clients for individual counseling at home, and then I fell on the floor in my family room, and I really injured my back. I was in a lot of pain, and I finished up with those, but I just felt I couldn't take any new clients for a while. And it was when I was lying on the floor that I had seen this butterick pattern, and it was of a granny doll, and I'm lying there on the floor thinking, oh, I haven't done any sewing for a while, and I had a granddaughter by then. I thought, I can make that granny doll. And then I could just see writing on the apron pocket, "Votes for Women." And so that was the first doll that I did. And then when I was going to the local attended congregational church, and they called, and Bob and I had taken a trip to Europe, and they wanted me to do a slide presentation. Well, I almost put my thumb over the camera. I am so just not talented at all. And I said, well, I won't have a slide projection, but I will have a program. And I'll have some dolls that represent women who get the right to vote. And it was almost like that, who said that? I mean, it was just such a new idea for me, and I didn't really think it through. And I thought, oh my gosh, I should do it. You know, and so I wrote down the names of these women, and I had 10, the first ones, and they were just cloth dolls, and I hand embroidered the faces, and they were very rude, you know, just very simple. But one of the women in the church wrote for the Oakland Press, so she put an article in there about the program with a picture of the dolls, and I began to get phone calls, and that's how they were born.
Wow. So how did you decide on which women characters that you were going to feature? Were you able to find research on all these different women?
Well, there weren't, at that point, there weren't a lot of books written about that I was aware of. So I started out with the ones that I had heard about, you know, Abigail Adams and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucille Mod. And I don't know how I heard about Sojourner Truth. In my first program, I had the 10 women, and I put them in chronological order, so I think Sojourner would have been about the 3rd or 4th. Well, I gave her Ain't I a Woman speech, and I prefaced it like I always did about, I really had some feelings about being white and doing the black woman speech, and yet I felt she was so effective in the women's movement as a whole that I needed to do her. But I did it in chronological order. Well, women were crying and getting their Kleenexes out, and I thought, I can't go on. I've got to stop. And somebody came up to me and said, Gladyss, remember, you always save your strongest character to the last, and I don't think there could be a stronger one than Sojourner. So from then on, when I would get to that point, I would say I would tell why. And I also, about the 2nd or 3rd program I did, I was still uneasy doing Sojourner as a white person. I didn't want to disrespect her at all, and yet I couldn't leave her out. And I did a program for some teachers in Pontiac, and one of the men that was there was black, and he gave me the most precious gift, because I went through my song and dance about my hesitation about this, and he came up to me afterwards and he said, you must never apologize for doing Sojourner. You can't be white and black at the same time. And he said, and Sojourner's words must be spoken, and besides, for those few moments you were Sojourner. Even now I thought, what a precious gift he gave to me, because he freed me up, and that's, and I've always been in awe of the life that she led and the impact that she had.
It must have been fun when you would discover a new personality, a new person that needed to have their voice spoken, and you were the one. You were chosen to create a new doll and create a new script. And
yeah, well, there just was no way around it. I mean, they had to, and I've always been grateful for her. Yeah.
So the dolls were made. What's the process of making a doll?
Well, the first dolls that I did, again, were just cloth dolls with hand-embroidered faces, and I did the clothing the best way I could. And then I wanted to do them better and have them, I'd still do cloth faces, but have them hand-painted. By then, Nancy Bishop, who was a Rochester woman, a lovely lady, did watercolors and was a beautiful artist. So I had visions that she would paint the faces, but I had to have somebody do them. Lynn Musson was in our church, and Bob had he was a scoutmaster with Lee Musson, her husband, and Lee Musson was good in carpentry. So Lynn Musson and I did the first set, and then the refining was done. First refining was done by Lynn Musson with Nancy Bishop painting the faces. And Lee Musson and his son Brian did the wooden stands. I then wanted more definition, but prior to that, there was, this gets complicated, but there was a woman that was walking by my house every morning, going down to St. Andrews, I figured. And then she'd come back, and she was very stylishly dressed, very clad, with, and just had an air about her. She lived upstairs next door, and Frank Seibert had made that into a two-family, so I had some feelings about that. Mm-hmm. Rah, 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 you know. Sure. But it's funny how sometimes things you rail against turn out, because this woman was so elegant, and one of the times she walked by, I invited her in for a cup of coffee or tea, and she came in and she introduced herself. She was Marinella Pia Moccabini, and she was from Trieste. And she was in the process of getting a divorce. She said when she was, well, I'm getting the cart before the horse. She sat down and we were having the tea, and she looked up, and by then I had Bob put these dolls on the stands on the wall, and she looked and she said, asked about the women, and I said, well, there are women that helped get us the right to vote. And she said, oh, those women's, what they mean to me. She said, I was 13 when I decided that America was the place to come. And she said, I talked myself into being in love with a serviceman. So she married and divorced, and then she remarried, and it ended up, she was getting a divorce. She had come home from Trieste. She was nursing her, she had gone back to Trieste while she lived there next door to me. She was nursing her mother who was dying of cancer. She got home, and her husband took her to another house, to her daughter's house, and she had to get a court order to get her sewing machine out of the house. But she looked up at these women on the wall, and she said what they mean to me, and said, if there's any way I can help you, I've been a dress designer for 13 years. And once she got her sewing machine out of the house, then she and Lynn worked together on developing the costumes. Well, Marinella was very severe and very tailored in her dress, very stylish, but severe. And she didn't like all this frou-frou of the 19th century. And Lynn had more of an understanding of the necessity to keep them historically accurate. So they had some very interesting discussions. And so that was the second set. Then I wanted to do another set. I wanted more definition, and I don't know whether you need to know all of this,
yes,
but anyway, you've given me carte blanche, so yes, yes. I was teaching classes and developing my classes there, and I one time during the I had developed a class on marriage and family, my 4th hour, and I was getting suicide calls from students, and my family was calling my closet, broom closet, my phone booth, because on Sunday nights it would often happen that when the phone would ring around 10 o'clock on Sunday night, I'd think, here we go again. And anyway, it was hectic. 4 children and a husband and
it was the days before having a cell phone and go to hide. You were tethered with a long cord.
So, and I don't claim a pipeline with God, you know, but I prayed one night at 10:30, and I remember, and I'm not patient. I want an answer right now. Well, nothing happened, and I went to sleep. But the next day, I had seniors, and they went to a class meeting, and this student that I had 4th hour knocked on my door, and she handed me a note, and she said, "I hope you'll understand." And it was from a student in Rochester that said, "Dear Mrs. McKenney, you said something 4th hour that really bothered me. You said you were not creative, yet you helped me create a new picture of myself. Please don't ever say you're not creative again. P.S. I don't know why I'm writing this. It's 10:30 at night, and I've been wanting to watch this television program." She still lives in Rochester, incidentally, and she's had psychic experiences, several of them that have been always with a loving atmosphere. Years later, the same thing happened. I said, "I need to know by midnight." Never, again, not long on patience, but 12:01 the phone rang, and she had been married to this man that she had taken my marriage and family class with. And she said, "Mrs. McKenney, are you all right?" Anyway, I took that. I should continue to teach for another year. She's now doing, I'm writing a book now, and she's doing the cover for it, the book. She's still in Rochester. But anyway, it's been, I wanted, the note, the importance of that note is, now that note had been 2 or 3 years before I did, or longer than that. I felt I needed more definition, and I needed them to do them in porcelain. And when my father used to say, "None of us are creative," what he really meant were none of us are artistic. And I realized that after, you know, when she wrote me that note. But I thought, if I'm going to, I mean, the idea of my sculpting them, the heads and the hands and the feet of these women that I never even knew, and it was just really kind of far out. But I thought of that note. That was very important. I signed up to the Birmingham Bloomfield Art Association, and I just felt like I was a fish out of water. I mean, I didn't really belong in that world. But I did a bust of my mother, and I put a little necklace on her, "Votes for Women." My dad always said that Eleanor Roosevelt was trying to wear the pants in the family. And my mother said, "Your dad and I never discuss who we vote for. I have a feeling we may cancel each other out." But anyway, I did this bust, and I had the picture of my mother, and the instructor bent his head down to talk to me the last day of class, and he said, "Broke your heart, didn't it?" Because I wanted to look like her. And he said, it broke your heart, didn't it? It shouldn't have. You're good." And then when I did the head, at the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame, I took just the heads, the little clay heads that I had done, and they were on display with that quilt that I had done. And I was defensive of them, and I thought they weren't good enough to show. And the director of the museum said that there was a woman that came in to see the exhibit of the heads. And she said, "I don't know who did these, but whoever did them, tell her that I've taught sculpting for 30 years, and these are excellent." And Bob said, "How the heck, how much validation do you need?" But it was just like, I felt like I could do those, but no more. I mean, I don't do his any more sculpting. But
if you had to rattle off all the names of your dolls, do you know all of them by heart? You know the names of each
the
one?
names, the order that I did them.
Sure. Do you remember that?
You want me to? Well, I'll start. Abigail Adams, the Grimke sisters, Angelina and Sarah, Lucretia Mod, Matilda, well, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Then I included Amelia Bloomer, Susan B. Anthony. Oh dear, the one. Well, Alice Paul, of course, and Carrie Chapman Cat, and Sojourner Truth. And Amelia Bloomer, I don't know if I said her. I don't know, I'm out of order now. I don't know where.
Yeah, we have some of them out here on display.
Oh,
somewhere.
I didn't even look at them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you have, is there one of the personalities that resonates with you more than another? Do you have a favorite?
Well, apparently Lucretia Mod. And I say that because when I was inducted into the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame, it was right after Bob died. Bob died in July, and it was August, I think, and I thought, oh, gee, don't let me get up there and cry. I mean, and so what I did was I needed to say a thank you to him because he'd been so supportive, but I didn't need to stand up there and blubber in front of this group. So I told him he had taken a woodworking class, and he wanted a project. Came home, he said, he wanted a project, and I said, well, I need a cupboard for the fabric for the dolls, about 5 foot by 6 foot. And he said, well, I was thinking of a jewelry box. And so I told that, and it got the chuckles, and it kind of relieved me. And then I said, I yield the balance of my time to Lucretia Mod, 19th century preacher. And I turned around and I came back and I tried to assume the demeanor of Lucretia Mod. And I had found a quotation that she had said about what it means to be philanthropists. But her last line was, and I long for the days when the rich get richer and when the rich don't get richer and the poor don't get poorer. But that, and of course, then that gave us, people just rose to their feet, but it was in tribute to her, not to me. But so I guess that tells you Lucretia Mod was the one. She was a 19th century preacher, and at one point the mob was racing towards their house to burn their house down. And one of their friends was quick thinking. He got in the middle of the mob and yelled, "On to the Mott's house," and took them down a side street so that and by the time they figured out, well, they'd been fooled, or they were all too tired to burn the house down. But anyway, I think Lucretia's, because she spoke out, you know.
At this stage in your life, what's your message, whether it's to women or people who feel like they've been, you know, held down, held back? What do you hope your message is that you pass on? Is there something that you hope resonates long for many years to come?
I wish I had some great words of wisdom to expound. But I think to own their own gifts, and all of us are gifted in some way, and to not be fearful to explore their own possibilities and the possibilities in other people, and be open to each other's stories, listen to each other's stories without judging, and just especially in these times, people are hurting terribly, and there's such a tendency to be with our own group, and I'm as guilty of that as anybody. And we need to just listen. Where is the anger coming from? How can we go back? You know, the term "the soul of America" is used so much now, and I think it's very appropriate. And change is frightening, and there are so many people hurting. And I think of myself when I heard these. I was living in a bubble in 1965. I still live in a bubble. And when I heard the stories of these students of mine, it was like they were talking from a different world. My family, my parents had always grown up with be what you can be, do what you can do, you know, and I knew I was loved. And there are so many people hurting today. We've got to be open to each other's hurt and respond with the love. It's a challenge for all of us today. So.
At some point, then you realized with all these dolls, you donated them to the Rochester Hills Museum, and they're part of our archives and our collections. How do you want us to use them?
Well, it's a different era than when I was. I would hope they would be part of a celebration of women coming to terms with their own humanity and seeing their own possibilities and changing relationships, but also the necessity to speak up against injustice. And, you know, can I tell another story about? Sure. I took a sabbatical after I got the doctorate, and during that point, I was asked to take Sonia Johnson. Now, Sonia Johnson was a Mormon woman who ran for president, actually. The only one that had her presidential campaign completely paid for. But I went to Springfield, Illinois, when the Equal Rights Amendment was going to be voted on in 1982. And there I met Sonia Johnson, and she chained herself to a wheelchair and was on a hunger strike. And she chained herself then to the door of the legislature. And Phyllis Schlafly had ordered a helicopter to fly over the crowds that were gathered, so we couldn't hear the speakers. It was just because of Phyllis's very clever. Anyway, on the way back from that, there was it was like 2 o'clock or so, I don't know, or midnight anyway, in the morning, and the bus driver pulled off to the side of the road, and he got out of the bus, and he stuck his head back in, and he said, "Don't any of you move. Somebody's jimmying the wheel. Another revolution, we would have rolled." And I was just astounded. I was the only one on the bus of these about 20-some women who hadn't had either sugar in the gas tank, slashed tires, broken windshields, death threats. I was just like a babe in the woods. I didn't realize that. But then later on, I was able to, they called me because I was home on sabbatical, and they called me, asked me to pick up Sonia Johnson, who had been at the Springfield thing. And I took her, they want me to take her to Michigan State, where she was going to speak to a group of students. And she was very active in the movement for the Equal Rights Amendment. On the way there, she told about being married. Her husband was with her at the basement of this Mormon church, and the church fathers told her that God would no longer listen to her prayers because she had spoken out for the Equal Rights Amendment. And it was devastating to her, but this was the kind of thing. And then in connection with the Equal Rights Amendment, back after the last set of dolls that were done, Bob and I went to Washington. We made an appointment at the Smithsonian Institute and to talk to the costume department for them to critique. They were very complimentary, and they gave us, approved them all except for the Grimke sisters. And if we had thought about it, we found dresses that fabric that looked exactly like the pictures that we had of the two women, but they were made of polished cotton. And they said at the museum, Smithsonian, the Grimke sisters would never have worn a product of slave labor. But we couldn't find anything else that looked like it, so we never did change that. So that's incorrect. But they also told me about Amelia Fry living in Washington. And Amelia Fry was an author that was a friend of Alice Paul, who had written the Equal Rights Amendment. And so we called Amelia Fry, made an appointment with her, and took pictures of the doll with us. And she was very gracious to. She talked about being with Alice in the, I think it was in the House. I don't know whether it was in the House or the Senate that it was introduced first. And she thought Alice would, after her struggle to get the Equal Rights Amendment introduced, she thought she would really be enthused about it, but instead she was pacing back and forth, just furious. And Alice asked her, what was wrong, and she said, "It'll never pass. I wrote it with the word gender, and they put the word sex in it, and it will never pass." And of course, it took a long time before it finally did. But so that's the dolls took me in some strange paths sometimes, but.
Sure. You talked about a book that you're working on right now. Is there still another project out there?
Well, I have to. The title of it is Navigating the Seas, the letter C of change. One day I walked into a book discussion group at our church, and I was thinking about social change and the things that are involved with it. And I thought of crisis and I don't know which three that I thought of, but compassion and conflict. Anyway, conflict, and Brad Barnes, a local retired pediatrician, I was telling him about this, and I said, ironically, all these words start with C's, and he said, "Oh, you've got to include compromise." And anyway, we started in talking about it, and it just seemed like a fun kind of a thing to do. So it's navigating the seas of change, and with the 10 chapters, and cognitive style I had done my dissertation on, so that's a big chapter there.
So how's it
then
going?
The subtitle is Finding Hope in a Sea, S-E-A, of Change. Mm-hmm. And the day before you were picking up the dolls, I thought, I really ought to call Thea Terry. Her name is Thea Terry Boyce now. Her father-in-law used to be the manager for the old A&P down here in Rochester Road. She's never seen the dolls, so I really ought to, because, she was a part of that, and I asked her to come over, and she and her husband came over, and they looked at the dolls, and we had a really nice talk. And the next day, she asked if she could bring over something she wanted me to see, because I had told her about the book, and I said I visualize it'll be a sailboat with the lighthouse in the back. So she brought over a painting that she gave me that she had done some years ago with the sailboat with the light, and the waves are in the form of seas, and so she's done the cover for the book. I have the cover done, but I don't have any of the chapters done. So, but it's Finding Hope in a Sea of Change, and so it's a challenge. And if all of my family members read it, that'll be 45 people. So,
when we look back on on your life and your accomplishments. I'm aware of 4 women from Rochester who are both in the Michigan Women's Hall of Fame and our local Community Hall of Fame. And those 4 women are Matilda Dodge Wilson, Sarah Van Hoosen Jones, Dr. Bertha Van Hoosen, and Dr. Gladys McKenney. That's quite a group of people there.
Well, it's been a wonderful area. It's been an area that I think foments social change. One thing, it's been financially fairly prosperous, but there have been people that have been long-range thinking, building schools and supporting the schools, and I think that's been a big part of...
So Rochester's been your home for a long time.
Yes, we now have a little plaque on the door. It's 1953. We bought a house on an unpaved road. I mean, we bought the lot. It was a vacant lot, and we had the house built there.
And you're still in that house.
Yeah. And we've added on, and we've added on. And,
yeah, as each of those kids were growing up, your kids all grew up in the Rochester area. You know, Bob has passed away now. 7 years ago, I think we were just talking about. So it's... I'm very fortunate. 3 of the 4 children live in the area. And one is in Cincinnati, but we maintain contact, and it's. I think Rochester was good for them to grow up in. And they used to play in my front yard, our front yard, and we thought, I was thinking, just because we're such a good family. I said, one of the neighbors asked one of their kids why they were always in McKenney's yard, and they said, because they don't have any trees. Good. As we wrap up a program, and knowing that these dolls now are part of the Rochester Hills Museum collection, and then we will care for them as well as you had. We knew where they were in your house. We know we're the ones that took them out of the cases and all that. For generations now, we want to inspire people. Anybody who's ever felt like they've been held back, whether they're African American, or whether they're poor white, or whether they're wealthy white, or Arab Americans, or Native Americans. The goal is that these dolls will be an inspiration for everyone. So we hope that that's what you would want us to do too.
Well, and you spoke of Native Americans. I didn't do a Native American, but in doing for this book that I'm writing, I found a book called The Sodina-Shawnee Iroquois Woman, and it told in there how Matilda Joslyn Gage, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott were invited to tea for lunch with this Iroquois, and in New York. And it was there that they learned about the matriarchal form of religion and the political and economic influence of the feminine. And that was very influential in forming their program for the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls in 1848, because it was just prior to that they met with these Indian women. And I hadn't realized it had that much influence on. There was a whole little booklet written about it. So,
all right,
that will be in my chapter on community.
Okay.